Right. I think it's working now. All right. Hello, everybody. We are again continuing with President's Week this week. Well, not week, but month. I'm so sorry for the wording. But anyway, we are moving on here. As I said, I want to try to get as close to Abraham Lincoln as possible. I want to try to get him done in hopefully by early March. So that way I can kind of leave off the presidents for a while and kind of move on with some other topics that are not so much related to that. But I'm only doing this again because last year I did not get as far as with this. I didn't even get as far with the channel as I was hoping I was going to get just because of how things ran and stuff got in the way, and I really didn't have all the time I had initially thought I was going to have for that full year to devote to the channel. But this year we're going to try to change that. So without further ado, this week we are covering the 11th president, and by this weekend I'm hoping to also cover, if I have time. If not, it would be next Monday that we post it, but we will be covering the 12th. This week we are covering the 11th president of the United States, James Knox Polk. This is probably not a president that most of you have heard of. Very few people have actually ever heard of like the presidents in between Andrew Jackson and Abraham Lincoln. Very few people actually have heard of these guys. So Polk is definitely an odd one, especially just the last name in general, Polk. I don't know of anyone nowadays or ever that was ever named Polk, but he was our 11th president, and unfortunately, it's kind of sad that James Polk is forgotten a little bit because he did play a critical role in the 1840s during his single term as president. He did play a most significant role in the expansion of the United States, but unfortunately, and it wasn't really, I don't really think he didn't intend this, but that same expansion that he brought to the country also kind of, in a way, helped lead to the Civil War, which is now, by this point, we're less than 20 years away from. And as we'll see going into next week, with the 12th through up to Lincoln, the 1850s are increasingly dominated by the slavery issue, and it leads up to the Civil War. Many historians and scholars will actually say that the Civil War technically would have started during about 1854, 1855 when Bleeding Kansas occurs, but that's up for debate, which we'll cover when we get to that point, which is only about a week or two away. So, nonetheless, we're going to go ahead today and cover James Polk, one of our lesser known presidents, but also one of our more significant presidents that is really not thought that much about. So, as always, we're going to just go through here a biography of him a little bit, and then we'll get into the effects and details of their presidency, the events, I should say. Okay, and starting out with their birth, James Polk was born on November 2nd of 1795 in a log cabin. He is another of the log cabin presidents. He was born to his parents in Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. So he is a Southern president. For once, he's not a Virginia guy. Virginia has been laid to more presidents. They can lay claim to that more than any other state. Virginia has the most presidents that have come from her. The other one being Ohio. Ohio is actually second in number of presidents that have come from a state. Now, James was the eldest of 10 children. He was the son. His parents were Samuel and Jane Polk, and they were wealthy farmers and slaveholders in North Carolina. And James was very sickly growing up. He was never really a healthy child, and this kind of caused him to not really have the brightest of childhoods. In 1806, Polk moved with his family. The whole family decided they were going to move out of North Carolina, and they moved to the somewhat newly founded town of Columbia, Tennessee. Now, keep in mind, this is 1806. Tennessee had just become a state 10 years earlier. His father became a planter and businessman once they established themselves in Columbia, and as always, James continued to be quite sick, and at one point when he was a teenager, he actually had to have an operation for urinary stones, which we think, oh God, urinary stones, that ain't bad. Well, I'm sure it ain't good. I'm sure it don't feel good, and here's the bad part. there was no anesthetics or how they pronounce it back then. There's no painkillers. There's no numbing agent. So if they got to do an operation, you feel it. And they're going up inside his body to remove these stones. That's not going to feel nice. And apparently the story is that when they did this, they had, even though James was a teenager, but back then it was commonplace, they gave him brandy to try to dull the pain, which is supposedly where Polk kind of got a taste for brandy, ironically, when he was having the surgery done. In 1818, Polk actually graduates from the University of North Carolina. He actually went back to North Carolina to attend his college education, and he graduates from that college with honors. He studies law under a Nashville attorney, as Columbia, Tennessee is actually not as kind of a suburb, kind of very close to Nashville, the capital of Tennessee. In 1820, 2 years after this, Polk was admitted to the Tennessee State Bar, and he opens a law practice in Columbia. So he starts out as a lawyer, which is commonplace for a lot of politicians back then, that you got into it through your practice of law. Even Abraham Lincoln himself, as I think we've all famously heard, he was a very good lawyer in Illinois during his early career. In 1823, 3 years after he starts his career, starts up his law office in Columbia, he is elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives, where he becomes friends with none other than our favorite Democratic man, Andrew Jackson. Now, of course, this is before Jackson's 1824 campaign against John Quincy Adams, in which he loses. He yells that it was a kind of corrupt bargain, as he says it. And in 1828, Jackson eventually becomes the presidency. And Jackson will have an influence on Polk. Him and Polk actually remain good friends throughout their lives. Now, Jackson, of course, died in 1845, right when Polk becomes president, shortly after he gets inaugurated. But nonetheless, there is a connection between Jackson and Polk that we will have to take a look at here. In 1824, while he is a representative in the Tennessee House, he marries Sarah Childress, who is a well-educated and a Presbyterian like himself. So they get along very well. Unfortunately for him and Sarah, they never have any children. And Sarah, however, during the course of James's political career, be it a senator, be it a representative, be it president, she kind of acted as his main kind of political advisor. She was his confidant in every move that he did during his career. And while she was First Lady, she actually banned hard liquor from the White House. So there was no such thing as whiskey in the White House. That was banned, at least as long as she was in there. In 1825, Polk leaves the Tennessee State House of Representatives because he gets elected into the U.S. House of Representatives as a representative from Tennessee. He serves 7 terms in the House, and eventually he becomes Speaker of the House. He is the Speaker of the House of Representatives between 1835 and 1839. So during the very waning days of Andrew Jackson's presidency and during most of Martin Van Buren's presidency, at least the first two or 3 years of it. Now, during his time in Congress, Polk becomes much closer to Jackson, who he already had met during his time as a state legislator in the Tennessee State House, but he becomes much closer to Jackson during this time because by this point, Jackson is now President of the United States. Polk eventually becomes Speaker of the House. He's a prominent congressman, and he identifies with Jackson so much that he, of course, joins Jackson's Democratic Party. He is a Democrat. Now, Jackson kind of becomes a mentor of sorts toward Polk. Polk adopts a lot of Jackson's policies. He supports the states' rights issue that Jackson does, but he also supports dismantling the national bank, which was a big aim of Jackson and the Democrats. And this kind of follows Jackson so much. Jackson teaches Polk so much of the political ins and outs of Washington and kind of influences his behavior politically that he earns the nickname Young Hickory because Jackson had been known as Old Hickory. Well, they see that Polk is kind of this protege of sorts, is the student of Jackson. So they say that you're so similar to him that we're going to call you Young Hickory. You're the young version of Jackson. In 1839, Polk leaves the House. He leaves his job as the Speaker of the House's position and as a representative in the House to become the governor of Tennessee. And there he serves 2 non-consecutive terms. He does not serve them back to back. He actually loses re-election the first time. He comes back when his successor's term's up. He does win election, and then he loses another bid. This brings us up to 1844. And this is the year that Polk gets elected. Now, in 1844, Polk was kind of an unexpected person to receive the Democratic nomination for their presidential candidate in that year's election. Initially, the big hope was that Martin Van Buren, if we remember, the 8th president who had lost his re-election bid in 1840 against William Henry Harrison, there was the initial thought and hope that Van Buren was going to be the one that would get that nomination, that he was going to try to run again. And Van Buren did try. Unfortunately for Van Buren, he failed to receive enough nomination votes to actually get on to. He failed to get a majority of the nomination votes from the delegates of the party. He did not get enough to claim the nomination as president. So, and after a couple of votes, it still was this way. So eventually it became known to the Democrats, okay, it's obvious Van Buren's not going to get it because our people, our delegates, don't support him. So we need a compromise candidate of sorts, and to appease the North and the South. Well, Polk was popular in both, so they decide, okay, since Van Buren's not going to get it, why don't we nominate Polk? And they nominate Polk after Martin Van Buren had failed to secure the nomination. And Polk becomes what we call a dark horse candidate, and this term is technically a candidate that is very seldom known to the general public, but they're nominated as a candidate anyway. Outside of his home state of Tennessee, Polk was not really well known. Now, when I said that he was well liked by the North and South, he was liked by the Northern and Southern Democratic Party members, but he was not known on the wider level. But he becomes the first dark horse candidate because outside of Tennessee, Polk is not really a name that people recognize. He's not someone that people know. He's not like, for example, in 2016 when Donald Trump announced his running for the presidency for his first term. Everyone knew who Donald Trump was. He was this big old businessman who had written books, who had become this millionaire, had had like 3 wives, had been accused of cheats, financial scandals, whatever else. But everyone knew who Donald Trump was. He was a famous guy, kind of like when Ronald Reagan ran. Everyone knew he was a former movie star. He was an actor. He was a governor. People knew his name. Polk, they don't know his name. And this earns him that title. And the Democrats choose Pennsylvania Democratic Senator George Dallas as Polk's running mate in 1844. So the race is now set again between Polk and the Whigs nominate their own party, one of their own party founders, of course, that famous Henry Clay, that famous senator from Kentucky who had also been a part with Tyler and Harrison, as we previously discussed, and had been against Jackson. Now, Clay, he and the Whigs kind of taunt the Democrats. They kind of play this dark horse narrative to the point that why should we vote for a candidate where we don't even know who the heck he is? Because the Whigs come up with the catchphrase and the campaign slogan of, "Who is James K. Polk?" Basically telling the people, why should you vote for this guy? Who is he? You don't even know who he is. Why would you vote for him? You don't know what he's going to do. And the Whigs play it as, well, you shouldn't vote for him because you don't know him. The Democrats turn this to their advantage and say that, well, no, this is why you should vote for him. Blah, blah, bam, 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 bam. They start listing stuff, and it's not just listing stuff. It's that they never change Polk's campaign message. Clay and Polk, for example, both supported the annexation of Texas, which was a big issue at the time. Now, Clay was not as consistent with his messaging. He at times would make it seem like he was in favor, but at other times he'd backtrack a little bit and people would get confused. Like, wait a minute, the last event you said that you did support it, now you're kind of making it seem like you don't. Polk never did that backtrack. He consistently stayed with his message the entire way through. He never changed anything. And Polk was a states' rights advocate. He advocated that southern states and every state should have their own states' rights to determine certain things, but he was also an expansionist. that he not only wanted to annex Texas, but he also had aims to gain the Oregon Territory from Britain and to even possibly buy California off Mexico. And to make matters even better for Polk, Polk knew that the political climate of, well, what's going to happen if he does well? Is he going to want another term? Then I won't vote for him. So Polk kind of decided, he told the American people then and there that if you elect me, I promise I will serve only one term. I will not run for re-election. And this eventually, these promises and this consistent messaging kind of outbeat Clay and the Whigs, and it wins Polk the presidency in that November. The election results of the 1844 election were the follows. Polk gained 49.5, he won 49.5% of the popular vote. Clay won 48.1%. And the Electoral College, which decided it, Polk had carried 170 electoral votes to Clay's 105. Clay carried 11 states, while Polk carried 15. This gains Polk the presidency in the 1844 election. Now, before we continue here, I just want to show these two right now. They're appropriate for what we already covered at least. This is a picture of the house down in Columbia, Tennessee, near Nashville, that you can go to. And this was the house that James Polk kind of lived in during most of his early career, before he was president. This was his house. This is actually the only private residence of Polk's that is still standing, and it's known as the James K. Polk House. But you can actually go see it down there in Columbia. Here we just have a electoral map of the results of the 1844 election. The blue states were ones that Polk carried for the Democrats, and the yellow ones are the ones that the Whigs for Clay carried. Ironically, not really ironically, but as you can kind of look, a majority of Clay's support comes from the kind of what would be considered the West at the time, Kentucky and Ohio, even Tennessee to a point. But Tennessee at this time is becoming a little more associated with the South. But it's also strange because Polk was from Tennessee and he didn't even gain Tennessee. That brings us to Polk's presidency. Now he has gained the presidency at the end of 1844. So Polk, as always, back in the old days, the inaugurations were not in January, they were in March, and Polk is inaugurated on March 4th of 1845. He takes office. Now, he wastes no time pursuing his expansionist aims of manifest destiny, which was an idea that the United States was destined as a nation, as a country, as a power, to expand its borders all the way across the continent to the Pacific Ocean, that it would have a coast on the Pacific and a coast on the Atlantic. We already had the Atlantic coast, but we believe we were destined to control the lands out to the Pacific. And Polk was a very big believer in this idea. It was a driver for people to move west. It encouraged American settlement and encouraged many people, the government, to kind of try to herd the Indians onto the reservations, which was wrong. But Polk was a very big believer in this, and this is part of the reason why he was such an expansionist. Polk, for his administration, because mind you, he's already said he's only going to serve 4 years, not 2. He's not going to run for re-election. He sets out 4 primary goals for his administration. Number 1, he wants to reestablish the independent treasury system. Up until this point, the government has put its money in finances and loans into private government-sanctioned banks. It does not have its own deposit box for them yet. And there was at one time, back during the 1790s, but unfortunately, once the Federalists fell out of power, the Democratic Republicans got rid of that. So Polk wants to reestablish this. Number 2, he wants to reduce tariffs to help the South in particular, whose cotton prices have been rising due to foreign tariffs on American goods in response to our tariffs on them. So if we reduce the tariffs on foreign goods, foreign nations will lower their tariffs. Number 3, he wants to acquire some or all of the Oregon Territory, which we'll discuss here momentarily. And number 4, he wants to acquire California and New Mexico from Mexico, which at this time, Mexico controls most of what we would call the American West. At this time, California, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado. These are all Mexican territory. Nevada, too. This is not U.S. territory at the time, but we want to buy it. We want control of it. And initially, Texas annexation was a major part of Polk's plan, but the process was already kind of started just prior to him getting in office, because as we kind of said in the last video, just before President John Tyler left office, he went ahead and basically signed the bill that would allow for the beginning of Texas's annexation to the Union. So the process was already well underway by the time that Polk took office. And eventually, all Polk did was had to sign the final annexation document that formally recognized it in December of 1845. Now, that brings us to the Oregon Territory. Now, I do have a small little map here. Find it. Right here we are. Now, since 1818, since the presidency of James Monroe, the U.S. and Britain had held a disputed land claim to the Oregon Territory up in the Pacific Northwest. You may recall that this was also the same year that a treaty was signed between Britain and the U.S. to kind of straighten the border between American territory and British Canada in the Louisiana Purchase. Basically, that straight line that most of the border of Canada is today out in the west. Well, this only went up to the Oregon Territory because that was still disputed at the time. Now, Polk and other expansionists, there had been ongoing dispute for years over who was going to get that territory. Would the Americans get all of it? Should the British get all of it? Should we split it? What should we do with it? Because neither side was willing to relinquish a claim. Now, Polk and other expansionists, they desired the whole territory for the United States to the boundary of 54 degrees north, 40 degrees west latitude, in which they basically came to the conclusion one of their campaign slogans for their campaign was 54-40 or fight, basically saying that either the British accept that we get the whole territory or we will go to war with them. Well, Britain wasn't really in the mood for another war with the U.S., it really was not, but neither was the United States. It was kind of a bluff. But in order to appease the issue, eventually what Britain and the U.S. do is they come to a compromise, and they agree that they will split it about halfway down the middle. They will split it along the 49th parallel, completing the modern U.S.-Canadian border in the west and securing the Pacific Northwest in 1846 in the treaty that actually officially does this. So without a war, without any bloodshed, Polk has kind of pressured Britain by just kind of bluffing to them, saying that either you give me the whole or we're going to have some problems. Britain kind of says, well, how about we give you half? We'll split on that even same line that we established years ago. And this is kind of a map of that, which I got a pen here somewhere. At least I did have a pen. There it is. I'll show you before I actually do it. Okay. What we have here Okay. I'll highlight what we have here. All of this is the Oregon country. I'm just going to edit this as we go. This was the Oregon country, the Pacific Northwest. Now this is the already established border at the 49th parallel that had been established in 1818 out of the Louisiana Purchase lands. This part up here, that's Canada. This down here is the United States. This is what's being fought over. This whole area right about where British Columbia is, where Vancouver is, Seattle, Washington, the state of Washington in general is being fought over in Oregon. Now, I don't know if you can see it, so I'm going to kind of outline it. The farthest the U.S. wanted was the 54-40 claim, which means up here's the 54-40 line. Here's the modern boundary of the U.S. They wanted basically all of that territory up to this line. So the U.S. border would go like up there. And Vancouver would be a U.S. territory. Britain, by comparison, they also wanted all of it. And they wanted down to the 42nd parallel, which is down here. So what they eventually come to the compromise with, since they kind of decide to split the territory instead of go to war over, is to come to the 49th parallel line, which is right here. Oh, I kind of let that line off just a little bit. So we just continue the border that we already had here in 1818, and we're just going to use that to split the territory. And that's eventually what happens. Ugh. Now, Polk has already accomplished one goal of his administration. He secured some of the Oregon Territory for the United States, good half of it. So within a year, he's already accomplished this. Unfortunately, California and New Mexico are not going to be so easy. And this is going to be a highlight, probably the highlight, of Polk's presidency. Now, what happens is, starting in 1846, tensions have already arisen between Mexico and the United States because, as we recall, the year earlier, the Republic of Texas was formally annexed as the U.S. state of Texas. Mexico had never recognized Texas's independence and claimed that it was still a Mexican territory. And thus, when the United States kind of annexed it, they kind of claimed it was illegal to do so and that the United States was illegally taking Mexican land away. Now, another problem arises with the factor that Texas claims that its southern border is the Rio Grande River, which is the modern border of southern Texas. Mexico claims that this is not the case, that the southern border of Texas is more northernly. It is the Nueces River further north, and that they argue that there is no way that it could be the Rio Grande because when Texas had been part of Mexico, the province of Texas, the Mexican province of Tejas, or Texas, its borders had not gone south of the Nueces. Texas had claimed further. Now, Polk sent ambassadors to Mexico to negotiate the Rio Grande boundary for Texas after it was annexed, and he offered an additional $25 million that basically, okay, I want this border for Texas, and then I'll throw in $25 million if you'll sell California and New Mexico to me. Partially because, in California's case especially, it was not very well militarily defended by Mexico, and the fear was of the United States and Polk that European powers such as Spain or Great Britain may try to seize California, and he didn't want them gaining the West Coast. So what he basically comes to the conclusion of is, I'll offer to buy it first. Mexico, due to its ongoing grievances with the United States and its ongoing kind of this, not just I'm trying to think of what the perfect word would be for here. Uh, Either way, I think the point is that either way, Mexico's kind of ticked with the United States. It's not really willing to negotiate anything with them, so it's not really going to push to sell them California and New Mexico, even if they offer $25 million, mostly because they're mad. Right, sorry for the brief pause there. But as we just mentioned, they're not willing to sell, which angers Polk. Polk is not really willing to say, okay, no, I want that territory. You're going to give it to me one way or another. And what Polk basically does is he sends a detachment of soldiers to the disputed land between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande River between Texas and Mexico, basically saying that I'll just occupy the territory. But in Polk's mind, it was not to occupy, it was to kind of provoke Mexico into making the first move that might give him justification for a war to take the territory, which is kind of the sneaky side to Polk. And at the same time as he's sending these troops, he also sends military officers to California to try to foment a rebellion to occur in that territory. Now, the troops that are detached to Mexico are under the command of General Zachary Taylor, and they end up being attacked by the Mexican forces when they reach the Rio Grande River. Because keep in mind, Mexico claims that this is their territory. Now they have American troops in their territory. They're going to attack. When Taylor refused to retreat backward, they opened fire. Well, this gave Polk the excuse he wanted, because following the Mexican attack, Polk claims that war had kind of been forced by him. It hadn't been his decision. The Mexicans had forced the war on him. And he asked Congress for a declaration of war in April of 1846 in order to attack Mexico for this heinous outrage. Well, the Whigs, they see right through Polk's ruse. They kind of point out that you deliberately sent troops to an area that another country claims as its own. What did you expect was going to happen? And second, they kind of knew that Polk had been wanting California and New Mexico, and they said, this ain't related to that territorial grab, is it? Because I think it is. And they very much were not very supportive of the war effort. In fact, Abraham Lincoln at this time is serving a single term in the House of Representatives as a Whig. And he is among those who challenges Polk's account of the events. And in Lincoln's own words, Polk desired, and in this point I quote, military glory, that attractive rainbow that rises in showers of blood. Despite the opposition of the Whigs, Congress eventually declares war against Mexico in 1846, and the Mexican-American War was fought for the additional 2 years. During that time, the United States utterly destroys Mexico. Mexico never really stands any chance against the United States. The Americans capture all of the West, the American West. They capture California. They capture New Mexico. They capture Colorado, Utah, Nevada, Arizona. They capture all that territory. They capture the rest of the territory that Texas has been wanting. And to make matters even worse for Mexico, the U.S. lands an invasion force at Veracruz on the Gulf and then marches and actually takes the Mexican capital of Mexico City and occupies it. In 1848, the war is brought to an end with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which in the treaty, it's very much unfair to Mexico. The Rio Grande is recognized officially in the treaty as Texas's southern border with Mexico, and Mexico is given $15 million in exchange for ceding the Mexican cession. That includes most of the American West, as we mentioned. So, in hindsight, the Mexican-American War, it's also been called one of the most unjust wars ever waged by a stronger nation against a weaker nation, because it was an utter blowout for the United States. It was just an easy win. And it also plays a role with the Civil War because a lot of the generals and commanders of the Civil War, their first major military experience was serving when they were younger in the Mexican-American War, including Robert E. Lee and Ulysses S. Grant. Now, at home, Polk is enthusiastic with the war. He just accomplished his second goal, and he also goes on to reduce tariffs while he's home and creates an independent U.S. Treasury Department. So by the time that he is nearing the end of his term, Polk has accomplished all four of the goals that he promised he was going to set out to do. Also during Polk's presidency, you have the Naval Academy, Smithsonian Institution, and the Department of the Interior are established. And he adds two new states to the Union during his time, Iowa in 1846 and Wisconsin in 1848. More pictures here. Right here, I want to do this one. This is a portrait picture of Polk and his cabinet, minus the Secretary of State, James Buchanan. This is 1845. And this is significant because this is not only the first picture taken inside the White House, it is also the first picture of a presidential cabinet. And right here, this one is Polk. Here we have the first picture of, I don't know if it's the very first, but I think it's one of the first pictures of the White House. This is taken in 1846 during Polk's presidency. And here we have kind of just a diagram of the military campaigns of the Mexican-American War. All these arrows are basically where the U.S. forces went. We can see they just seized the American West up here, up to California. They seize all that, and then they launch through the Gulf, go down here to Veracruz, and head right into Mexico City and take it. It was very much Mexico had stood hardly a chance in that war. Here we have a portrait of the U.S. before Polk was president, the same one that we've seen with John Tyler. Just a quick review. Texas was getting annexed, but it had been formerly its own republic. This is all part of, this is the disputed land here. This is Mexican territory. This is Oregon country. And then up here, by the end of Polk's presidency, he's completed pretty much the lower 48, almost, other than this small strip of land in southern New Mexico and Arizona that still technically belongs to Mexico at that time. But Texas is gained, Mexican cession right here, California and the rest is gained, and so is the Oregon country, basically the entire West. We have a portrait here of James and his wife Sarah. That's taken during their time in the White House. So when the 1848 election comes, Polk, as mentioned, keeps his promise. He doesn't run again, and he does not run for a second term, which means he leaves office that year. He leaves, not that year, but the year after. In March of 1849, he leaves office and he returns back to his home in Nashville, Tennessee. However, the White House years had kind of stressed Polk beyond repair. His health had declined due to the immense amount of stress he had to put up with during those 4 years, and he never really recovered from it. And his health declined, and on June 15th, literally maybe 3 months after he left office, the poor guy died at the age of only 53. He died on June 15th of 1849. He thus has the shortest retirement of any president, as he was only out of office for 3 months before he died. And then he was buried initially at his house, at his home in Nashville, but eventually in 1893, his remains were moved into a tomb by the Tennessee State Capitol building, where they still remain to this day, which this is an image of that you can go to the Tennessee State Capitol in Nashville, and he's buried right outside on the grounds. So that basically concludes for Polk. He's very much although he's not very much remembered, I mean, Polk can boast one thing that a lot of presidents can't. He accomplished all of his major goals and aims in 4 years. In his one term in office, he accomplished every goal and aim that he set out to do. And that's not something a lot of presidents can say they've actually accomplished. Although they may have accomplished some, there's not a lot of them that can actually say that they accomplished all of them. So, so basically, what this does here is it sets up the stage for the coming of the Civil War, because the new territories out in the West that have been gained now reignite the slavery issue, because now there's a question, is slavery going to be allowed in these territories? Because only a fraction of them are on the Southern Missouri Compromise line of 1820. And as we're going to see starting in the next president here with Zachary Taylor, who served in the Mexican-American War, we're going to see the explosion that starts occurring over this argument that will eventually lead to the Civil War. Polk is really the last president to serve over a somewhat united nation. After this point, the nation just delves into a divided society of chaos, not too much from what we have today. So that concludes for this video. As always, like, subscribe, comments, any questions, I'll be happy to answer them in the comment section below. Any suggestions, as always, be sure to put them there. I hope everyone continues to do well. I have not really thinking that we got a big snowstorm going on, but if anyone is freezing their butt off, stay warm. So that concludes for this. Hopefully we'll see you back here with the next video for Zachary Taylor, for our 12th president. But so until then, have a good day, and may God bless you all.